The issue I wish to tackle in my PhD is to understand what's the relation of Taiwanese with the past nowadays, and which also it's also linked to of course the democratization process of Taiwan, and how in what is considered now like a stabilized democratic society, how the more like authoritarian past is pursued. And so even when people talk about memory, they might think it's just about the past, but actually it's more about the present. So it's a bit different than history, even if it's related to history. In the mainland China, for the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, Chiang Kai-shek, who was, of course, bad, I will say, like a really evil character in the 70s, in the 60s, of course in the 50s, and time of Mao's era. Now he became kind of much more positive character. And so all those reconfiguration of memorial narrative in China has some echo with Taiwan. You can see first that on movies, where like Chiang Kai-shek is kind of patriotic hero. You can see that on how they talk about the Second War against the Japanese, which is the one of the Second World War. Now they talk about all the nationalist effort against the Japanese, whereas in the 70s or in the 60s, Kuomintang was as bad as the Japanese, for example. When the DPP came to power, they said that they tried to actually erase Chujianghua, to get out of Chiang Kai-shek, so to erase Chiang Kai-shek out of the Taiwanese symbolic landscape, and to create something new. But actually, in the same time, they create a lot of like historical sites, which are directly connected to the nationalist past of Taiwan. So somehow they helped to craft something which wasn't there before, which I will say like historical remains of the 50s, 60s, and of that past linked to Chiang Kai-shek. And when the Kuomintang came back to power, they could actually, it was actually like kind of help for them, because they could like introduce themselves with like having a long history. Yeah. So then we can have a kind of memory which is expurged from the most problematic aspect, even though you have, of course, Urba Memorial, you have lots of things on by Sekongbu and so, but on the other side you also have like Chiang Kai-shek without the problematic aspect, I will say, because you have victim, but you don't know exactly who did what, you know. So it's always like the Kuomintang did, or like this period that administration did, but you don't know exactly, and you didn't have like a process like you had after the Second World War in the fascist regime in Europe, or even in the former communist regime in east of Europe. You didn't have that in Taiwan. Since the opening of Chiang Kai-shek diary, because they are now in Hoover Institute, and not all of them, but most of them. Since the opening, we can say a new trend in historiography, which is more, I would say, comprehensive. Whereas before, Chiang Kai-shek was like the man who lost China, so how could he fail so miserably, like from being the leader in the 30s to the surprising like communist victory. But now it's more comprehensive, and it's let's say more linked to his private person, to his thoughts, his strategy, which is something different than before, because even during the nationalist era, Chiang Kai-shek was kind of like a mighty figure, and not like a private person, not a private man. Like you could not visit, for example, Sherlin and see like his favorite, like his living room, the kitchen, and so on. You know, like now that's the Chiang Kai-shek that you can see, and that's what is put on stage somehow in Taiwan. And in the West, now you have like reassessment of his historical role towards something more neutral, which is not just criticize but also try to understand. Taiwan in the early 80s and Taiwan now is like so different than I came in Taiwan in 2006. We cannot think about how it was just in the 80s, like just in the early 80s. Whereas, for example, well, we are French. We can think about like what was France in the 70s is not so far away from us. Whereas what was Taiwan in the 70s, it's really like there is a huge difference. So it's really all those evolution are really, really significant and really like really, really interesting. Then what is Taiwan today? It's in terms of election, in terms of, I would say, like formal democracy, it works totally perfectly. I think everybody is agree on that. Then in terms of what is democracy, because democracy could also see as being like a culture and more than just election. I will say that the situation in Taiwan is not ideal, and there are some issues just like everywhere, but in Taiwan maybe also because of the fact that Taiwan is not in a more legal framework because of the position in the international scene. It might have some direct consequence in terms of human rights, for example, and in terms of other issues. So, and also Taiwan is being democratic for like a really short period. So maybe like in terms of culture, democracy is not fully achieved yet